This episode is sponsored by Coffee Friend. Coffee Friend is an international retailer for everything coffee, from a diverse selection of quality coffees to a variety of coffee machines that suit any coffee lover's needs. They are a leading source for coffee goods in the Baltics and making waves all over Europe. As a team of serious coffee connoisseurs, Coffee Friend is here with you on your coffee journey and even has a live chat right on their website. Visit them at www.coffeefriend.co.uk. You're listening to The Coffee Podcast, where our focus is people and our language is coffee. I'm Jesse Hartman. Hey folks, it's been a while since my last episode, so let's do a little catch up first. I have 3 quick updates. First, this is my last episode for 2021. I know a lot has been happening in coffee this year and I've barely touched it. For example, coffee Arabica price is at a 10-year high as of this Wednesday. CNBC reported that New York's Intercontinental Exchange showed the coffee C contract price at $2.46 a pound this week, which is the highest it's been since 2011 when it was close to $3 a pound. Obviously, COVID has had all kinds of impacts on coffee and coffee people, and I wish we could have talked more about it on the show this year, but we're going to get to that in 2022. My second update is I have episodes and series in the fledgling stages for 2022, but I'm having a baby this week. Oh, and I'm not exaggerating. My baby is actually coming this week, a baby girl between now and sometime in the next 48 hours or so. So I'm going to be a little distracted for a while, and I'm totally cool with that. And finally, the last update is about social media and the podcast. I've historically managed Instagram from my phone, and that's been kind of the main place I've socialized with people who listen. But due to the most recent whistleblower news about parent company Meta, aka Facebook, my wife and I made the decision to delete Meta-owned applications from our phones. This may be permanent, but I'm unsure at this point. So in the meantime, I'm not going to be checking that platform unless I happen to think about it while I'm on my laptop, which is kind of rare. Not rare that I'm on my laptop, rare that I'm checking Instagram from my laptop. So if you want to stay in the know and in touch, please subscribe to the Coffee Podcast Newsletter, which is an email that I infrequently send. I do personally write all those emails, so it's like hearing from me directly, and I'll share coffee discounts, interesting coffee articles, or whatever is on my coffee mind. Now to this episode. This episode is the result of my public radio debut on BBC Radio 5 Live, which was heard by something like 9.5 million people, according to BBC staff. I was asked to be on the show to answer Ask Me Anything questions about coffee.
Jesse Hartman is host of the Coffee Podcast. Joins us from Austin, Texas. It's 4 a.m. now, and I would imagine you're well fueled. Welcome to the BBC, Jesse.
So glad to be here. It's a pleasure.
I cannot wait to hear what you're going to say and what people may well ask.
Slightly nerve-wracking. It was at 10 a.m. London time, which was 4 a.m. Austin, Texas time, so I didn't really sleep much. And you know that's because I was just so calm the whole time. No, I wasn't calm. Luckily, I wasn't alone. Co-guesting was the current executive director of the British Coffee Association, Paul Rook. We both have some takeaways, and we're both a bit surprised at the direction that the show went. And we decided, hey, let's debrief on the podcast, since that might be an interesting conversation. Spoiler alert, I got something very wrong in front of that 9.5 million people. Paul, welcome to the Coffee Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you. I'm excited to dive into the topics today, but before we get started, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you ended up in your position in coffee?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jesse. It's good to join you. So I've spent my working career in trade associations, trade bodies. Most of that time has been in agriculture, so field scale crops, wheat, combinable crops as we would call them here, but also working in animal feed, in fertilizers and agrochemicals. And then a couple of years ago, I thought it's about time I had a change, and the opportunity to move into the coffee trade organisation came up. And a degree of familiarity that some of the issues that we're talking about are very much the same. The way in which organisations run is very much the same. So there's a certain amount of comfort there, but some other challenges, and it's been great. Obviously, COVID was I think on the first day that I started, we locked down in the UK, so that was not the ideal start, but. And it's a bit of a shame we haven't been able to get out and meet the members and see, as most of you will know, if you want to understand something, you need to get in front of it and see it, and it would be great to get out and meet some of the members. But hopefully we will do that as we get into 2022.
Cool. And off the mic, you were telling me you are a farmer. You went to school for farming. Your wife went to school for farming, and you'll do that together. Can you give me a little bit of background to that?
Yeah, I guess in a way I've always been a frustrated tractor driver. And so about 20 years ago, we got the opportunity when we actually moved from out of the London area in more into the countryside. And we got the opportunity to rent some land, and then we bought some sheep, and then we moved again and bought some more land and bought some more sheep. So it's a good pressure relief valve, I think, is how we sort of see it. It's something to do at evenings and weekends, and it keeps you busy, but it's a different sort of pressure, and we do enjoy it. And we used to take the sheep to show them, to show them at shows, to really get them, decorated up as it were, and yeah, we enjoy it, but it's mainly it's something different. It just takes the sort of the pressure in a different direction, and we enjoy it.
Well, we met under some just weird circumstances. We were both on BBC Radio Live 5 Live. And we didn't really get to talk to each other. We just kind of hoisted up there, thrown into the deep end, and callers from all over the UK were dropping questions. And before we talk about sort of our experience with that show and what we were thinking, what we hoped we could share and that sort of stuff, I want to kind of know, how did they reach out to you? What was that experience like? What were your thoughts and feelings going into this live radio show?
Well, I mean, obviously I was aware that it was a new program, and the presenter had just moved from one program on the same station and had set up this new program. And actually one of my colleagues also used to work for the BBC. So they contacted her and asked if we were interested in taking part in this sort of new venture. And yeah, I'm always happy to talk to people, always happy to sort of try and explain, what the industry is about, who we represent, and was quite keen to talk about some of the challenges, because obviously the audience, the vast majority of the audience, if not all, would be coffee drinkers on a daily basis, and and there are some big challenges ahead for the industry, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to explain those issues and explain how we saw some of the challenges, and also explain how we saw the consumer sort of fitting into that going forward. And climate change probably being the sort of the central one that I was keen to talk about.
Yeah, I think going in for myself too, I was expecting, hey, I've been asked to be a participant, fielding some questions. We're going to talk about, I don't know, ways to brew coffee, and what are some things we've learned, over the course of many series of podcasting. It's been 6 years now. And I think for me, the direction the conversation ended up going was not, I wasn't expecting it. And maybe that's in part because I'm in the U.S., I'm an American. The way we talk about coffee, at least in general over here, seemed slightly different than what I was hearing from callers calling in and wanting to talk about. Kind of like this, a lot of emphasis on this idea of coffee as an addictive substance, which, is a conversation in and of itself. But what was it like in your seat as you heard the questions coming in? What were you thinking, or do you have perspectives about the things that were said from callers and sort of the bent on being a coffee addict or these kinds of things that we were experiencing on the show?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I had a slight advantage in that I didn't have to get up in the middle of the night to do the program, which you did because the time difference certainly worked against you, and I felt for you for that. I was in the middle of the morning. I'd had my breakfast. I was sort of just moving gently into it, but. Yeah, you're right. I mean, we do in the UK have a little bit of a thing. It's not quite humour, but it's not also too serious about being a coffee addict. It's almost a throwaway comment that sort of people use. Having said that, I wasn't sort of expecting to sort of focus on that to the extent that we did. I suppose. I mean, I'm aware. As I said earlier, it was a new program, so it was a new format, and I think the sort of the ring in and ask questions bit for a Friday, we were the first people to do that. And if I had any sort of complaint, I would say I just don't think that with it being a new program, that they'd sort of planned out exactly what they wanted to achieve from that particular sort of segment. I mean, I did listen to because we were on in the second hour of the program. It's a 2-hour program. We were on in the second hour. I listened to some of the first hour, and there were completely different subjects. To start with, they were talking about the Soccer World Cup, which is in Qatar next year. And some of the challenges that has thrown up in terms of worker welfare, safety, etc. And it was quite similar that there was a slightly sort of disorganized approach to it, and people were just sort of almost. I guess I was expecting the presenter, who's is quite a seasoned presenter, to have sort of themed what he wanted to talk about and given people given the audience a clue as to some of the things we would like to talk about. There was a reference right at the start to deforestation, which certainly in the UK and a European context is very important, because we've got a lot of legislation being talked about around deforestation at the moment, and coffee being part of that. And I would have been quite keen to get on to that, and I thought we were coming back to it, and we didn't. We sort of got sidetracked by people wanting to talk about yes, the addiction, but also their favourite coffees, and coffee's a great topic in a way, isn't it? Everybody has a different view, and that's the beauty of it. I don't think anybody has the right view. It's the right view for you. I'm not a connoisseur. I'm quite happy to sort of admit that. I have a massive range of different coffees, from instant through to whole bean, to ground, to the capsules, the single serve capsules. And I have all of that because I like the different sort of types of coffee. And I think, it would have been nice to have talked a little bit more about some of the serious aspects. And I think, maybe we can sort of touch on some of those today, because I think, whether you're in the UK or the US, some of those issues are the same, some are different, but, we do have a lot of common challenges ahead. And, the consumer, the audience needs to be aware of those, because it will impact on them to some extent, whether it's availability, whether it's price going forward, etc., etc. And people need to sort of be aware of these things. It's good to talk about those.
Yeah, I agree, and I want to touch on some of that in a second. But first, this show was broadcasted, I was told, to more than 9 million people were probably listening around the UK. Do you think the way that the conversation went represents the average person in the UK, their perspective of coffee, and this idea of kind of focusing on caffeine, or, how much fat is in the milk that I'm drinking? Is that your perspective? I know we're not talking strictly statistics and, population samples and all this. We're just going off of your perspective. But is that how conversations typically go, or was this kind of bent in a direction, kind of biased?
I think it's fair to say that you do have a lot of sort of conversations around those, and that the fat content of milk is a good example, because certainly in the UK over the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen a move away from what we would call full fat milk to semi-skimmed, and then a lot of non-dairy milks being brought in, whether it's soy milk, whether it's oat milk, whatever it may be. And there's a lot of conversation around that, and sometimes you sort of sit back and you think, well, if I buy the full fat milk from my local dairy, it's only about 4% fat anyway, so we're talking very small numbers. we do as a nation sometimes sort of fixate on some of these issues. So it wasn't completely alien that we were talking about, or people were coming in and talking about those sort of things. Maybe the presenter, is aware that maybe his coffee consumption on a daily basis is maybe a little bit more than he would want it to be, and it's sort of almost a bearing of his soul to explain why he wanted to sort of focus on that. But I think we do have a lot of those conversations, but they don't necessarily represent the population as a whole. As with most topics and most countries, you'll find that there's a minority of people can get very exercised about a subject, want to talk about it. The majority probably just stay silent.
Yeah, I hear that. And, the conversation for me, I didn't mind talking about any of these things. And I'm not really criticizing BBC and the way they conducted, the show. It was the first one after all. And I think there's something to be said about them choosing coffee as the first topic. My impression is coffee is really approachable as a topic. I do want to know, what are some of the topics you hope to cover and touch on the show that you didn't get to touch on? Maybe we'll pick one or two and we can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was interesting for me because earlier in the week, so the beginning of last week, we ran a webinar as the association where we were wanting to look at some of the climate issues and look at some of the other species of coffee that are being investigated. Some of the older species that have been forgotten about and are being rediscovered. And so we had a couple of people on from Kew Gardens in the UK who have spent a lot of time and a lot of years doing sort of research. And we were wanting to talk about that and maybe also at the same time some of the new sort of scientific technology that's coming, the gene editing that in the UK we've had some sort of decisions on that from the government during this year. So how do we tackle some of the problems like coffee rust? Do some of these new technologies give us the opportunity there? What should we be doing? What should we be thinking about? For the next 20 or 30 years in terms of I suppose I have four very simple sort of questions that I keep posing, and I like to keep things sort of simple. And so my questions are, let's look forward 20 years because that's not too many generations as far as coffee's concerned. Let's look forward 20 years and let's ask ourselves, how much coffee is being produced in comparison to now? Where is it being produced in comparison to now? Who's producing it? And are they still producing at the same sort of quality levels? Because, if the answer to any of those questions is no, it's a concern, and we should be thinking, okay, how do we start addressing that? Is it in terms of research? Is it in terms of technology? Is it in terms of helping the grower to understand, how he can continue to grow coffee where he does, rather than having to move his coffee plantation, say, further up the hillside, and then you have issues of deforestation. So those are the things we're quite keen to talk about. And as I said before, at least make the consumer aware that we're having these sort of discussions, that, these are the things that are on our mind. And they're on our mind because they concern the quality and the amount of coffee that we will be able to provide you, the consumer, with, and your next generation over the next 20 or 30 years. You can actually sort of simplify some of these messages. So, a radio audience can maybe ask questions. And, I was hoping, I guess, that one or two people would have said, is coffee bad in terms of deforestation? Throw the question out and we can sort of talk about it. What about sustainability more generally? What about water? If the temperature does rise globally by 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees, which is what has been talked about, will I still be able to get the coffee that I like? Those are the questions that I might have wanted to ask if I'd not been in the industry, but had heard that the program was on and thought, well, that is starting to worry me a little bit. So, those were the sorts of areas. And I guess also about, one of the market segments in the UK that is growing quite well is the capsule. So the single serve capsule that you'll pop into your machine and it's the predetermined dose of coffee. those capsules are recyclable, but in the UK, there's not a lot of understanding about how that recycling works. So I was expecting also some questions around that, and some of our members and some of the big coffee producers have set up a specific scheme in the UK, which takes the aluminium capsules and the plastic capsules, takes them from the home in various sort of forms via the local refuse collector, or you post them back, and you can recycle them. You have a company then that takes the coffee out and recycles the capsule, and that's quite a big thing. That's quite a big, it's quite a unique approach in the UK, and the industry is paying for all of that. And it would have been good to talk about that and say, if you're going to use capsules, you can recycle them, and here's how you do it. Here's the company, and explain it. So I'm not going to criticise the program. As we've said, if you said once or twice, and I have, it was the first one. But it was probably, if I had to summarise it, I would say it was a bit of a missed opportunity for both of us. And I guess we both had things we would have liked to have talked about, as well as like to have had some interesting questions to answer, and I think that's the missed opportunity. But let's hope we might get invited back as the first ones. We might get invited back in the second year when everything has settled down and we can have another go at it.
Yeah, I know the thing I'm gonna have nightmares over for the rest of my life is my comment about whole milk and the oat milk when they're asking me about the fat content, and I'm like, I don't know the fat content or the comparison. I didn't know it off the top of my head, and I couldn't Google it fast enough. And anyway, I said something to the effect of, maybe they're the same, and they're not the same. But anyway, that's beside the point.
Although I think did I read that oat milk has more calories though? I think. Which I think is probably the high protein, the high carbohydrates.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I wasn't going to know that off the top of my head. It
Exactly,
just wasn't going to happen.
I was busy Googling as you were talking.
Yeah, I'm like, oh man, I'm eternalized online getting that wrong. So, but anyway, as far as deforestation goes, do you have a few factoids on that? Something you can throw in this episode so our listeners can think about deforestation and coffee?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the UK, like the US, is wholly reliant on bringing coffee in from sort of third countries, and we're importing from maybe 60 different countries in total, and we know that deforestation is an issue in some countries more than others in relation to coffee. So Brazil is always the country that gets sort of focused on when we talk about deforestation, and I think coffee probably has less of an issue with deforestation in Brazil because it's located in a different area. We're talking more about beef and soy there. But in other countries, this comes back to some extent to, the whole sort of climate change issue, because I think people are finding that, if they're having to move the coffee to new areas, whether it's rust issues, whether it's water availability issues, whether it's the temperature issue, we're concerned about deforestation at the moment, really, because in both the UK and in Europe, we are talking about legislation that will put certain requirements on businesses in terms of proving that they are bringing commodities that don't come from areas that have been deforested.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah.
So the EU has a big regulatory package called the Green Deal, and only I think it's last week, they put out their proposals. And essentially what they will be requiring is companies to sort of gather a certain amount of information to prove that the coffee they're bringing in doesn't come from deforested areas. Now, in the UK, we've just had a new Act of Parliament on the environment that may well pick up a very similar theme. It's certainly talking about what we call forest risk commodities. At the moment, the UK doesn't have coffee within that, but it could well change. And we have another sort of legislative consultation before the end of the year, I think.
Okay.
We're all very sort of concerned about it, and I guess also it comes back to the education. We're trying to get our messages across to politicians and others to say, yes, we recognise the issues, and we recognise in the past, because there's no point in denying it, that coffee has been grown in areas that were deforested. Mm-hmm. I think from what I see in the last 10 or 15 years is actually the industry doing an awful lot to A, recognise that problem, and B, start to put in place programs, practices that actually start to move away from that, and even reforest areas, because we start to understand how you can use trees alongside coffee plants or coffee bushes to ensure that you can get a good production of coffee, that they can protect, they can probably shade from some of the higher temperatures that you might see. So it's coffee, probably more so than some of the other commodities, does have the opportunity to do things that actually start to move away from deforestation, and, as I say, move more to the reforestation. We've just put out a sort of a paper, an information paper, which also contains some examples of what some of our members have been doing in this area. So that's why it's a big issue this side of the pond at the moment, because because of all this legislation. I must admit I'm less sort of clear as to what the sort of the situation is sort of regulatory from the US side. I don't know. Is that something that people are starting to sort of focus on a little more?
I honestly don't know. I can tell you that deforestation doesn't really come up too often in conversation. The only times it's come up on the show have been when I have guests speaking from the UK. And in fact, Aaron Davis, who you mentioned earlier, y'all were doing a webinar. Aaron actually mentioned it on the show when we were talking about coffee science. And he basically raised the flag and said, hey, we need to be paying attention to deforestation. And so put it on my radar, something I've been thinking about, and I've, considered companies who are looking into this kind of stuff, like in Veritas, which is a company kind of focused on data transparency in a more rigid manner. You might have heard of them before. And yeah, I 100% agree with you. This is a really important conversation. Whether or not it's being talked about over here in the U.S. Very much, I have not observed that. I do think that one of the risks that there are in these sorts of conversations is that they're only happening in the circles of people who already know about it, right? If you and I talk about, deforestation's a problem, but the general public doesn't understand this or doesn't understand the nuance or complexity in the conversation, then we have an issue on our hands with getting, like you said, getting the message out.
Absolutely. And actually, it's interesting because it reminded me when I knew that we were both joining the Radio 5, I went back and looked at some of your earlier podcasts, and I think you had one, and I think it was probably in the spring of this year. And I apologies, I can't remember who said it, but they were talking about the science, and it was, if I can paraphrase them, it was almost there's not a lot of point in doing the science if we then can't communicate it to the
Right.
wider audience. And I think a lot of this comes back to this sort of point. We need to be able to explain to people some of the challenges, how we're approaching them, where we've got some good news to tell people, and explain why we're doing it, because it's ultimately it's for the benefit of the businesses, but it's also for the benefit of the consumer. Coming back to my point, I want the same range of coffees in 20 years time, or great, even more than now. I don't want less. I don't want to be forced to drink product A because that's all there is
Right.
left. Because we haven't paid attention to all of these things. So it's, to some extent it interlinks together. And your other point about data, I think is going to be key. And we're starting to see how data and data transfer and some of the technologies like the blockchain technology, how that might start to play a part in dealing with some of these issues, or at least providing the evidence of the base going forward. And it's like most areas of agriculture, of crop production, it's a fascinating sort of time to be involved. And I know at the moment pricing for everybody is a sort of a challenge, and sort of supply and is difficult. And I always say to people, if I was 20 now instead of in my mid 50s, I would be really champing at the bit at some of the opportunities that I see in these sectors going forward. We have to recognise some of these challenges, and I think grab the opportunity to provide some solutions. As we said at the top, I spent most of my life outside coffee. Coming into it, I have been very impressed with the amount of innovation that sort of goes on in all walks of life, with big companies, with small companies, and COVID, the whole COVID situation, certainly here in the UK has demonstrated that people's innovative ways of maintaining their marketplace, of going online, building websites very quickly. And I guess, the same in the US as well. People have been very innovative to make sure that, we're still getting our coffee on a daily basis.
Well, there's always more to unpack. But since we're coming to the end of this conversation, I wanted to ask you, what are some things you're working on? And how can our listeners be a part of that?
We're working on sort of deforestation issues at the moment. And I would say as an association, sustainability is a big part of what we're doing, because we have the whole net zero carbon agenda to try and work to, and companies working towards that. To my mind, in terms of linking in the audience, it does come back to trying to build this understanding of if we want to sort of maintain the sort of the variety of coffee that we have at the moment, the geographical spread of coffee. We've talked about, the UK and I think the US very similarly, importing from lots and lots of different countries, albeit we have one or two sort of major suppliers. But if we want to maintain all of that, we need consumers to understand that, it may be that the price will have to go up at some point to sort of pay for some of these things. And it may be that actually consumers should be sort of asking a little bit more, where is my coffee coming from? I need to sort of understand a little bit more, who's providing it. Are they able to provide it going forward? Are there other things that I should be aware of as a consumer? So I think those are the things we're working with. And actually, we've started a discussion with a number of associations sort of globally, so within the US, within Canada, and elsewhere, because we know that there are some issues that we, as I said right at the start, that we have in common. And where we have them in common, we're thinking, well, we ought to be working together to sort of ensure that we're all, sort of pushing the same sort of levers, if we can, in our respective sort of legislatives or whatever it may be. So, working with the National Coffee Association is a part of what I sort of do on a regular basis. And I guess the other thing that we're trying to work on, but it's proving very big and very challenging, is the whole issue of moving stuff about the world at the moment. Sort of back to COVID. Where are the containers of coffee? Are they in the right place? When are they going to arrive? Et cetera, et cetera. And that's that's a big issue that we've all experienced. And it has been a nice problem in a way, because demand has gone up and people are demanding product, but of course getting it to them has proved a challenge, and unfortunately will probably continue to be a challenge through a lot of 2022 from what I hear from those much closer to the issues than I am.
Yeah, I think part of addressing challenges, part of coming to a challenge, addressing it, is having the conversation and not having it behind closed doors. I think one of the things you mentioned earlier is the idea of consumers asking more questions. I think that encouragement of accountability across the sector, across coffee, it's the idea of, raising all ships, that accountability, that, hey, where are we at with deforestation as an industry? How are we addressing critical issues in our industry so that the future of coffee is bright for people, for the environment, that kind of thing? All of this can happen, or should happen, in my opinion, through open conversation. And so I'm glad that you came and you joined us on the show today to tell us a little bit more than we could get from that BBC live radio show. But my last question to you here is, you can kind of choose your own adventure. I have two questions. You can either share a piece of advice that you'd like to give to our listeners, something that you value over your lifetime, or you can tell us what your main takeaway is, what you really want our listeners to remember from this conversation today.
The takeaway, I guess, is, we all love coffee. And actually, I guess one of the things we haven't talked about, and I think where there may be a slight difference between where we are in the UK and where you are in the US is around the sort of, the health story. Because I notice, we are getting more and more sort of scientific papers now talking about the benefits of drinking coffee across a range of different issues. We had one just recently about, dementia as you get older and the benefits of drinking coffee, all in moderation. And, I think on the Radio 5, you talked about, what the sort of sensible levels of consumption are on a daily basis. coffee is a good product for us. It's a good product that we should have in our daily lives. But the issue, I think, is, therefore, if we want to keep that, we have to be more alive to some of the challenges that it faces as a crop in the next 20, sort of 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And we all need to be saying, okay, I'm hearing the sort of challenges, what should I be doing? What should I be asking? What can I do to sort of help? Sometimes it's just about, showing the enthusiasm to the people you're buying from, and that sort of feeds through, and that shows to them that they have a marketplace for doing the right thing, buying the right sorts of coffee, making sure that the producer at the very start of the chain is able to continue to sort of produce coffee. So I think it's getting a little bit more aware of the whole sort of coffee chain and some of the sort of the issues, and supporting the industry in trying to do the right thing, and trying to make sure that 20 years down the road we're still drinking the coffees that we enjoy on a daily basis.
Okay, if you stuck around to the end, you get a special treat. It's kind of special. It's a follow-up story to the oat milk fat content debacle. I legitimately hated that I got that wrong. It was in my brain. I couldn't get it out. I think I even had a bad dream about it. I like to think I'm developing into some kind of stats guy. So to get a stat that wrong in front of that many people is like being in my underwear in front of a large crowd, which is not my thing. It might be some people's thing, but that's not my thing. Anyway, I hit at one of my favorite local coffee spots, Houndstooth, and I chatted with a barista about my embarrassment on public radio. He wasn't convinced I was that far off, to my surprise. So he grabs the oat milk they use, Oatly, which is a very popular option these days, and we determined I was actually only off by a gram. It turns out the stat I searched on Google did not really account for what goes into most milk espresso beverages, the barista recipe version of oat milk, right? You don't just use any oat milk, you use the barista version, the one that steams better, and it steams better. In part, they add oil or they add fat. Well, I feel redeemed at least a little bit, but I still admitted that I was wrong to the 9.5 million people in the episode, so that's still a bit awkward. If you want to go listen to the episode, you can. I'll share the link on the episode description, but it'll also be on the website, and I'll shoot it off in the Brews letter if you subscribe there. Well, that's it for the year. If you like what I've been doing here for 6 years at the Coffee Podcast, please subscribe to my Brews letter by heading over to thecoffeepodcast.com. If you feel extra spicy, please leave the podcast a review wherever you listen so other people can find the podcast too. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, and until next time, happy brewing.